physics, logic, and ethics, that's the order I'm going to elaborate the Stoic system in. That is the order that a later period Stoic named Posidonius argued that it should be explained in. But other Stoics held different views about the order that these should be studied in, and in fact, every conceivable combination of which order they should be studied in was advocated by some Stoic at some point in time. All Stoics are agreed that the system, that these arguments and these positions and these views constitute a system, and that the system is meant to be embraced and accepted as a whole. And if one part of the system is changed, then either the whole system would have to be abandoned, or other parts of the system would have to be modified accordingly. And one last thing before we get started on it, I think that in a way, Stoic physics and logic seem more bizarre and difficult to understand than Epicurean physics and logic do. Although somebody raised a question about Epicurean canonic and logic and so forth, about can you explain to me their theory of vision, and I think I said, yeah, let me put that off for a few minutes and come back to that later, and then I never did. Part of the reason for that was lack of time and lack of nexus to the ethical stuff that I'm really concerned to teach here, but also the difficulty of that view. It's a bizarre view that is very disputed by scholars, and so it's difficult to explain briefly. So that's just to say there are also bizarre and difficult to comprehend elements of Epicureanism, but I think they are on the whole seem less bizarre and less difficult to handle from our standpoint. And that's because our standpoint has adopted those views as our own. So we believe in atomistic physics, and we believe in a kind of Epicurean empiricism. And in a way, I argued most of us believe in a kind of Epicurean hedonism. Now, when it comes to Stoicism, we're confronted with views in physics, logic, and ethics that are very, very alien and did not win the day in the end. We're not, arguably, we're not adopted. Now, actually, some people have argued that our contemporary physics is closer to Stoicism than it is to atomism. And that view is argued in a book called The Physics of the Stoics by Sambursky. It's one of the books that a student earlier wrote a report on, and that is collected in the collection of reports that I uploaded to Triton Ed. So if you're interested in the ways that Stoic physics does have contemporary analogies, for example, views about force fields and things like that, continuity of matter, their theory of time and so forth, then you could at least look at that report or even follow it up and look into the Sambursky book. But just a warning that this will seem very, very bizarre and different to you, but that if you looked at it from the standpoint of antiquity, actually the Epicurean view would have looked stranger, would have seemed more crazy. You know, oh, you're saying God didn't create the world, but instead it just flew together through a confluence of atoms that happened to become juxtaposed in such a way that certain things managed to be alive and then managed to survive in difficult environments and so forth. How could that possibly be the case? That just seems like a preposterous, ridiculous position. Well, what we find out is that in scientific inquiry, common sense views fade away and disappear, and the most bizarre things become the basic principles of physics and logic. And so the Stoic view, though it seems bizarre, may have some redeeming qualities, and we should try to be as open to it as possible and see what's good and what's bad in it. Now, because the Stoics are such systematic thinkers, they actually have several different ways of systematizing various aspects of their physics, and these correspond to ways of presenting their physics. So the longer, more elaborate version goes through all of these topics, beginning with bodies, then talking about principles, then elements, then God, then limits, and then place and void. A simpler arrangement divides it into three parts, where we just talk about cosmos, God, and principles and elements. And in your textbook, the Inwood and Gerson, you have elaborations of the Stoic system according to both of those kind of divisions. In the simpler division, each one of those three topics divides into two parts. The study of the cosmos divides into a mathematical part that essentially corresponds to mathematical astronomy or cosmology, and another part that discusses what we would call the natural history of the cosmos and its size, shape, composition, genesis, whether it's living or not, whether it's destructible or not, whether it's providentially arranged or not, etc. In the topic sorry, I've done something wrong here. This should say, not God, but causal explanations. Causal explanations, which they again divide into a mathematical science that deals with optics, harmonics, those kinds of things, where we take various fields of perception and then we come up with mathematical theories about how we can explain the phenomena in those fields. The other part of causal explanation has to do with essentially the psychology of explanation and how our causes constitute, how our analysis of causes constitute our knowledge about the world. And then the third division of principles and elements divides into essentially two parts, one active and the other passive, the active part being an account of God, the passive part being an account of matter. But allow me to elaborate basically following the lengthier version of this, and I will put my emphasis just on the topics that are most important, particularly for grasping their views about ethics. Because again, their views about physics are important for their ethics. What does physics mean again? Nature. Okay? And does anybody know what the main slogan of the Stoic ethical doctrine is?
Morality is the highest value.
Nope. But where'd you get that? It sounds nice.
I was reading Marcus Aurelius.
Okay, that's something they hold and they believe, but they've got this slogan that tells you how to live.
Be one with nature.
Where did you get that?
Wikipedia.
Okay, so that's about as accurate as a typical Wikipedia article. So there's some terms in there that are relevant, but it's not really capturing the main point. Yeah.
To live in accordance with nature.
Exactly. Live in accordance with nature. That is the main ethical view. It is a thoroughly naturalistic ethical system in that view, in that way. But, so if we say live in accordance with nature, then you might say, fine, but what's nature? And the answer is, we have a theory of physics. And so here it goes, it breaks down into these parts. And one must comprehend all of these parts and comprehend this physical system in order to understand how to live in accordance with it. Now, so starting with the more detailed division, the account of bodies. The first point is that for this system, as for the Epicureans, everything that is real is a body. And so, in a way, it's a materialist theory. There are just 4 exceptions to the claim that everything is a body. as in the Epicurean system, void is not a body, and the Stoics hold that void exists, although not in the same way that the Epicureans hold it. Place is not a body, time is not a body, and something they call sayables, or lecta, are not bodies. Now, I won't spend much time talking about void, place, and time, but I will discuss this idea of sayables or lecta when we get into their logic. Now, on the topic of principles, again, these divide into passive and active. Principles themselves are neither generated nor destructible. They are the basis for all generation and destruction. The passive element is what we call matter, which is just unqualified substance. It's the substratum for everything else that exists. And then an active principle, which they call reason, so it's a rational principle, and they actually just use the term logos, and they also identify this principle, this rational principle, reason. They say that reason is also the same as God, mind, the cosmos, fate, and Zeus. So it has a lot of different names, and it gets identified with all of those things. So if you like, you can just call it God. If you're really a pious person, you might want to call it Zeus. What it really amounts to is a rational ordering and organizing of this material substratum into the world that we see around us. And so the fact that all of the substances and the objects we see around us are amenable to being reasoned about and being understood is due to the fact that it's just a substratum of matter that has been organized by a mind or by reason in a certain way. So I can comprehend the nature of this table. When I get down, when I analyze it down to whatever the most basic material parts of it are, quarks or whatever, maybe then it just becomes a material theory that I can't give reasons why it exists that way. There's just values of certain constants or whatever that I can't reason any further about, and that's the bedrock point where we say, well, that's just the fact of the matter, literally. But everything else that I can give a rational account of this object, this piece of furniture, or these people, or whatever, is because there's a rational organization of it. And if there wasn't a rational organization of it, knowledge of it, of those things, would be impossible. So things that can't be known haven't been rationally arranged by reason, God, mind, fate, the cosmos, etc. Now, elements, they have a conventional theory of elements, so they identify four: earth, air, water, and fire. Elements are that out of which compound substances are made and into which they are resolved. But elements themselves, unlike the principles, are destructible and actually undergo a cyclical period of destruction. So in the Stoic cosmology, the cosmos, we're living at some stage of the cosmos, which is, let's say it's in the middle of a cosmic period. Eventually, this world will be completely destroyed, consumed by fire and so forth, and reduced to bare, unorganized matter. But then matter will eventually be reorganized by this mind into some sort of rational configuration, and that world will go on and persist and be organized according to reason and fate and so forth, and then eventually it too will be destroyed, and then out of the destruction of that, there will be created another world, and so they have a kind of cyclical view of cosmogony, where there's a cycle of periods of generation and destruction of the whole world. And in this period between worlds, there aren't even organized elements, but the first thing that sort of gets organized when a world is being built back up is that it's differentiated into elements, and actually the elements become separated out from each other, and then they can be recombined into a rational and reasonable order. Now, as I said, God just is the cosmos, and is nature, and is reason, and is fate, and so forth. We can define the cosmos as either just being God, so God isn't this thing that's sort of up there in the heavens or out beyond the cosmos or something, but actually pervades the entire cosmos. And so God is within this podium, and within these people, and within all of these objects and so forth, and the totality of all those things and how they all interact together is God. We also call the cosmos simply the organization of stars, sun, moon, planets, Earth, and so forth. And sometimes by cosmos the Stoics mean both of these things, the combination of the two, that is a, quote, complex of gods and humans and things that come to be for their sake. Yeah?
Would it be inaccurate to say that their view of God is that he's like the acclamation of all bodies?
The acclamation. What is acclamation?
That's not the right word. The accumulation of all bodies. Just all bodies in general. That's God.
No, that wouldn't be right because of what the word accumulate means. Okay, so God isn't just a heap of things all piled up on top of each other. God is the rational organization of all of these things. God is the fact that this matter is organized in a certain way that benefits human beings, for example.
I guess he's the cause
And that makes it all good. Whereas a mere accumulation of matter isn't necessarily for the sake of any good.
So God's not a material being. He's just the cause of all bodies?
He's a principle. He's an active principle.
Okay.
Okay, he's the principle of reason or organization in all of the things that exist in the cosmos, insofar as they are accessible to a rational mind, comprehensible, and organized for the benefit of living things and intelligent things, then that's what we mean by God.
Okay.
Okay, so it's not a creationist, intelligent design creationist story like we have in Plato, where there's a demiurge and he's a very skilled craftsman, and so he constructs the whole world, and he constructs souls, and he constructs animals and that sort of thing. It's not at all like that. It's an immanent principle within things that is what makes them reasonable, rational, and ordered for our sake. Okay, so this talk of being ordered for our own sake relates to the fact that their physics is what we call anthropocentric. That means that everything in this cosmos, in a way, exists for the sake of human beings. They wouldn't exactly put it that way. It's not so much that it exists for the sake of human beings as that it exists for the sake of rational beings, and humans are the most rational of beings. So it's also organized for the benefit of other animals, plants, and other things, but those insofar as they serve the purposes and the ends of rational beings. So the cosmos, in a way, is administered by mind or God, but again, by pervading it completely but organizing some things more and some things less. So inanimate things, such as stones and minerals and metals and that sort of thing, or even parts of bodies like tissues and bones, are have what they call a hexxus, or a condition that they're in. And that's the condition or the hexxus that something is in is the minimal level of organization. Below that is just heaps of things that aren't actually organized into anything. But if we go beyond a mere accumulation of matter into something that's organized, like a bone or like tissues are, or where we can say that there's structures like in crystals and metals and things like that, then we say that they have a hexxus. Now, some things that have a hexxus are even more highly organized than that, and those are things that have got a physis or a nature. And this relates to a use of the term physics that also implies growth. So there are certain kinds of material bodies out there that are capable of using nutrition and growing, namely plants. And so we say that plants don't just have a condition that they're in, like we say of crystals and stones, but we say they have got a nature. And then there are certain material bodies out there that have an even higher level of organization, one that corresponds to what they call psyche, that is, they're living things. Living things include all of the animals. So notice that the implication of this is that the Stoics do not take plants technically to be living things. Plants don't have a psyche. There's no such thing as plant psychology. There is a thing of animal psychology, and there's human psychology, because humans and animals have psyches, but plants merely have a nature that makes them grow. But when you have matter even more organized than something that also has a condition that its bones and tissues are in, and also has a nature that makes it able to grow and use nutrition, but it also can do things like sense and perceive things and move itself around in space, then we say that that thing is organized with a psyche. And finally, there's things that have all of those levels of organization, but even one more, those that have what they call a hegemon, or a leading part of their soul, an agent part of their soul, and this is human beings. So humans also have a hexxus, a physis, and a psyche, but in addition to that, we have something that animals don't have, and that is this leading part of the soul that is capable not just of perceiving things and moving themselves around in space as animals do, but actually grasping things and knowing about them and understanding about them and using language and reason in their own right. Yeah?
How much of this comes from or is comparable to Aristotle? Is just the distinction between all animals having a psyche?
It's too difficult for me to answer that without these people having any instruction in Aristotle. I mean, I'm very sorry that they're in that condition, but there's a bunch of differences. For example, Aristotle thinks that plants have a psyche. Okay, they both agree that the elements are those four, but Aristotle actually adds a fifth kind of element. Aristotle has different views about what God is and how his causality works, and on and on and on. Yeah.
So when they're talking about God, they're not calling it God. They're calling it like some kind of like rational thing, like theos, like proof principle.
Yeah, well, they do call it God too. They also use that term, theos. So they call it God, and sometimes they call it Zeus. If they're talking to somebody who calls God Zeus, they'll call it Zeus. You're going to call it Elohim, they'll call it Elohim. Whatever word you want to use for it. The point is that what it is a rational ordering of these, of the world.
So it makes sense, I guess, for a rational ordering of the world to be centered on rational beings. I mean, that's what.
Yes, and so that's a very Stoic argument.
I mean, that's what they're saying, right? That humans are the hitherto whatever.
Humans are the end of the thing because we're the ones that comprehend all of these levels of organization.
But the step isn't made to say then the hegemon is humans themselves, like the theos is humans themselves doing.
Yes, in a way, we're the really mental, intellectual part of God's operation here. Okay, and all of these other parts, plants and everything, have important roles to play in the system. If there were no plants, we would have nothing to eat and so forth. And if there were no animals, then work would be more difficult and so forth. But all of those animals and plants and so forth exist for our sake. Now, you might think that as a matter of physics, that's a ridiculous claim. As a matter of ethics, everybody acts as if that doctrine is perfectly true. Right? So everybody, or at least everybody that eats animals, for example, and just assumes they all exist for you must assume they exist for our sake. There's no problem with eating them because they exist for our sake. And I can only moralize as a vegetarian about this so far, because when you get down to plants, everybody eats plants, and no one doesn't eat plants, and so everybody acts as if plants exist for our own sake. They just take that ethical view and work it into their physics. It's just a physical fact of the matter that those things exist for our sake. Yeah?
Why don't they think there's a higher being that's more rational than human?
Well, they do. God.
God is the rationality.
Yeah. God is reason, and therefore that's a lot more rational than humans, because as we'll see, humans are capable of becoming confused and not living in accordance with nature. And that's why we need logic to figure out how to live in accordance with nature. Okay, but God doesn't get confused. Okay? And also the gods. There could be other gods around. Now they will have these kind of orderings as well. But there could be beings superior, there could easily be beings superior to humans, to run-of-the-mill humans. And in fact there are. They're called philosophers. Okay? And in their view, philosophers are superior to human beings and are like gods. And part of the goal is to become like God. Part of the philosophical goal and the ethical purpose of life is to become like God. That is, to become a perfectly rational being that isn't confused and doesn't do things out of accordance with nature, but does everything in accordance with nature. Actually, let me modify that for a second. The sage is like that. Philosophers are just people who are enthusiastic to become like that and are trying and are working to be like that and remain superior to the run-of-mill humans that have other lesser goals than that. But only sages and very few or no philosophers actually become sages. Sages actually are like gods in that sense, that they, not that they do things to organize their world and change their world and move material bits around in a way that is in accordance with nature. And so they are like God. Not like him in organizing the whole cosmos, but in organizing and ordering their own world, they're like that. Okay, now just a few more points about their physics. First of all, the cosmos as a whole is a living thing, and it's an animal, and of course it's considered rational, and they have various arguments for this. I think one of the weaker arguments is that since living is better than not living and nothing is better than the cosmos, then the cosmos must be living, for example. Another argument that seems a bit more compelling is that if a part of something is alive, then the whole of the thing is alive, and a part of the cosmos is alive. Therefore, the whole of the cosmos must be alive. This living rational animal is again equivalent to or identified with God. And thus God is a living thing and a rational animal, namely the one that orders and looks out for the whole cosmos. The cosmos is thus said to be something like the substance of God. Now, although they have this anthropocentric value system, they do not have an anthropomorphic conception of God. So I want to stress that. Unlike Plato, whose God is a lot like a craftsman that's nailing things together and actually designing them like an intelligent designer and creating them, this God doesn't look like that, doesn't work that way, pervades all of matter, isn't separate from it, and so forth. Instead, God is some kind of principle of heat or thermodynamics in their view that pervades all of matter and that generates the elements out of each other through separating them out and so forth by means of thermodynamic processes. Also, in their view, yeah?
When they say living, do they like make a distinction between mortal and immortal?
Sure.
So like, can something be living and still be immortal?
Yes, everything that's immortal is living. Something can't be immortal unless it's living. Right? Only living things are immortal.
And so
Immortal just means can't die.
right. And so is God and cosmos like immortal for them?
Well, cosmos isn't, because cosmos is cyclically created and destroyed. But God, the principle of the organization of this cosmos, or in a way, the whole cosmos just becomes disordered, but it isn't destroyed in the strict sense. They hold the principles that everybody else holds about conservation of matter and so forth. So the cosmos isn't destroyed into nothing. It's just that it undergoes this conflagration in which we can't even distinguish between elements anymore. Everything is just a kind of homogeneous, unqualified matter. But that's still God, and God doesn't die and doesn't go away, but reorders that world in the next cosmic cycle. Now, as I said, unlike the Epicurean view, there are not a plurality of worlds. There's exactly one world. It's spherical, and it is surrounded by an infinite void in all directions. So coming out from this cosmos is totally surrounded by void. There's no bodies whatsoever in it. Within the world is all bodies and no void. So they have a continuous theory of matter, not a discrete or discontinuous view of matter as the atomists do, who hold that void and atoms or bodies alternate, and within bodies, complex bodies are void, and within big stretches of void are complex bodies. I already said that the cosmos is destructible. That's pretty clear because anything that's visible, generated, and has parts that are changeable is destructible, and the cosmos has all those things, so it is obviously like any other visible object, something that will be destroyed and then eventually rebuilt. Now, nature operates through this fiery principle called breath, or pneuma, which has a constant inner and outer motion called tension, or tonos. And the tonos that things are in, the degree of tension, corresponds to these different orders of things. So you have matter in a certain degree of tension, and which degree of tension it's in corresponds to its hexus, physis, psyche, and hegemon. Now, this breath does a lot in the system. By means of it, we live, we breathe, we move, the soul is organized, and so forth. Now, another physical doctrine, perhaps the most fascinating one of theirs, is that everything happens by fate. So fate is just a conjunction of all rational causes, but everything has a rational cause, so everything happens by fate. Thus, prophecy and divination and prediction of the future is all possible. And that's not only because everything has a rational cause, but also because everything is rationally and providentially organized. And so if you know enough about physics, then you can actually predict what's going to happen. The cosmos follows a definite plan and purpose which we can discern, even though it's periodically destroyed and only bare principles of God remain. A new cosmos is always created according to the same principles, and so always follows the same fate. And so entire cycles repeat, and everything in particular is repeated in exactly the same way. Now, if everything's repeated in exactly the same way as I just said, then there would be a problem as to how world cycles could be differentiated. If everything was literally identical from one stage to another, then there would be no basis for saying that stage 2 wasn't just stage 1 without some complex account of time. But what they say is that there may be minor differences. So in the next world, you might have like an extra freckle, or if in this world you currently have an even number of hairs on your head, you might have an odd number of hairs on your head in the next cosmos. But none of these will be causally important for anything that actually happens. Thus, all of us will repeat these lives an infinite number of times and have already experienced them an infinite number of times. Now, it depends on whether you're a pessimist or an optimist, whether you think that's a good or a bad thing, but the fact of the matter is that we'll all be here in this classroom talking about this Stoic theory at some point eons in the future, and we've already all been here. And all of it will be repeated exactly the same, in the same order, and except for minor, barely noticeable differences. But all of the causally important and rational stuff will go exactly as it does now. Okay, and finally, everything that's natural lives according to nature, but humans are actually capable of becoming confused and failing to live in accordance with nature. And so the whole point of philosophy is to make one recognize what actually nature is and what's natural, and figure out how to live in accordance with nature. But the first thing we do in order to figure out how to live in accordance with nature is figure out how it is that reasoning and logic actually fail, so that we can avoid having it fail. Because if we avoid having it fail and we avoid falling into mistakes, then our natural reason will enable us to live in accordance with reason. Now here's the division of their logic, and that division of it essentially, and I haven't given you the subdivisions of rhetoric, and in theory each of these topics could be further subdivided, so I've given you a sort of minimal organization here. And in a way, they're in the reverse order of their importance to the overall system. So the most important thing in Stoic logic is an idea that there are certain presentations, certain appearances to us that are what they call graspable and, in fact, intelligible. So presentations, the Greek word is phantasia. They are what the things that appear to us. Among the things that appear to us, some we can grasp, some we can't. So some we just don't understand. We don't have any comprehension of them. We just see them, but they aren't actually caused by real objects. So, for example, optical illusions, hallucinations, things that appear to us in dreams. Those are all presentations that happen in our minds, but they're not graspable. We can't actually say anything about those objects because they don't really correspond to any real objects. They are merely appearances or presentations to us. But those that are caused by real objects that are actually out there in the world, they say are graspable. So the idea is basically that there are somehow tangible objects are, as it were, making an impression or an alteration on our soul. And among those graspable presentations, some are merely sensible. So if you think of the basic objects of sensation, like colors if we're talking about seeing, or sounds if we're talking about hearing, hot and cold if we're talking about touch, odors, tastes, and that sort of thing. Others are, however, intelligible. So when I look out here, I don't just see a field of a blur of a bunch of colors or something. That's what I'm sensing. But I'm actually grasping something intelligible, like that there are human beings here, that there are chairs, that this is a room in the shape of a square, that there's shades of light and darkness, that there are these like vehicles over here that have wheels that allow them to move and so forth. I mean, actually what I'm sensing there is black against white, but the fact that I can perceive that object as being a skateboard or something, so I actually perceive there's a skateboard there, and a skateboard is some kind of rationally organized thing. It's, I mean, I don't know, this is maybe the nerdiest thing of all time to come up with a definition of skateboard, but it's something like a, well, see if you can outdo me here. What would we say? A mode of transport that, with four wheels that, on a single plane, or something like that. There should be a rational definition, because if we can distinguish between skateboards and non-skateboards, or between a skateboard and a chair, then there's different reasons why the chair isn't a skateboard. Well, it's not a single board, it's not a method of transportation, and so on. But the point is that that's just a presentation in my mind, right? But if there's really an object there, and I'm not dreaming right now, there's really an object, and it's not just black and white, but I'm actually grasping what the thing is. Okay? And so they need there to be graspable and specifically intelligible presentations of things. And these we can differentiate from utterances, which are just vocalized sounds of any kind, of the kind that parrots can make, or that can reverberate in an echo and so forth. Some utterances actually signify presentations, and those are the ones that we're interested in from the standpoint of reason. So, but some utterances or confusions we can go through and work out which ones really correspond to presentations or not, and then the ones that correspond to intelligible, graspable presentations are the ones that we need to figure out what nature is really like and how we can live in accordance with it. Okay, and knowledge is acquired by a sort of linear unidirectional process. We start out with a blank slate of a newborn human. This newborn human has sensations, and at this point they really are just bare sensations of colors, odors, and so forth, but then they are able to create memories out of those when we have a plurality of such presentations which are similar in kind, and we remember them as being similar in kind, then they generate a kind of experience with things. And then through experience, we generate conceptions of what things are, or concepts of them. And we can do that either without instruction, in which case we just more or less grasp things, but there may be problems with them. If we formulate a conception through experience along with instruction, then the result of that they call a basic grasp of things, a basic apprehension of them. And so even irrational animals get presentations. Things appear to them a certain way. But the things that appear to them are merely appearances. They're merely kind of phantasms, while those that reach humans are able to be worked up into these concepts and thus be reasoned about. And furthermore, reasoned about, but also communicated with other people. And when we can communicate by means of concepts, then we can establish communities, relationships of justice, and that sort of thing. And the reason that animals cannot establish relationships of justice or communities in the strict sense is because they cannot communicate concepts, and that's because they cannot formulate concepts, and that's because presentations remain merely at the level for them of presentations. Now, there's a lot more details to be given about the system, but just stress two things. One is, it's at least superficial similarity to the empiricism of the Epicureans that we were talking about. So some later writers like Augustine say, oh, well, basically all these guys, the Stoics, the Epicureans, they all take as their concept of knowledge that it originates in sensation or perception. And so the Stoics do believe that anything that we ultimately know and reason about originates in sensation or perception. And we can't find anything in our conceptions that isn't tied to those things unless it's some kind of empty confusion. So that's one thing about it. The second thing is that it's crucial for them to claim that we're actually able to grasp and conceptualize things out of this process. It's merely because we're beings that are organized in a certain way, organized with a hegemon, and so that we're rational, that when we interact with these objects, we can actually conceptualize what they are and not treat them as mere appearances in our field of vision, either to be pursued or avoided. We can actually stop and think about them and reason about them and communicate about them to other people. But skeptics, among other people, have doubted that we can really that there are presentations that can be distinguished between graspable and non-graspable, or between sensible and intelligible. So how do we know that these things that we see in dreams or delusions or when we're on drugs and so forth, how do we differentiate them? They don't seem to have any particular quality that's different. So the Stoics contradict that and say they do have a different quality, and we know that we can grasp certain things and that we